There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that your life, your choices, your habits, even your private thoughts, could be reduced to patterns, analyzed and predicted with frightening precision. Not in some abstract science fiction sense, but in a way that cuts disturbingly close to reality. Because whether you like it or not, you are far more predictable than you think, until suddenly you're not. Imagine for a moment that someone with extraordinary resources decided to model human behavior at scale. Not just crowds, not just markets, but individuals, your reactions under pressure, your breaking points, your potential. Every decision mapped out as a branching path, every weakness exposed as a variable, every strength quantified. At first, the results would seem obvious. You follow routines, you repeat mistakes, you justify your failures with narratives that keep you comfortable. But then something goes wrong with the model. Because every so often, there emerges an anomaly. Someone who does not behave according to expectation. Someone who, when pushed to the edge, does not collapse but reorganizes. Someone who stares directly into chaos and, instead of retreating, extracts order from it. And that's where things become dangerous. Not just for the model, but for anyone who believed they had you figured out. The terrifying part isn't that you can be predicted. It's that under the right conditions, you can become unpredictable in a way that breaks the system entirely. That there is a version of you, buried, dormant, avoided, that doesn't comply, doesn't conform, and doesn't stop at the boundaries that were assumed to contain you. And the question isn't whether such a version of you exists. The question is what happens when it's forced to emerge, when the comfortable illusions you've built around yourself begin to crack, and you're left confronting the raw, unfiltered reality of your own capacity for discipline, for transformation, and for something far more formidable than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. You move through your life with the comforting assumption that your choices are uniquely yours, that each decision you make emerges from some deep and independent well of individuality. But if you examine that claim carefully, honestly, you begin to notice something unsettling. Your days are structured around patterns so deeply ingrained that you rarely even perceive them. You wake up at roughly the same time, reach for the same distractions, think the same kinds of thoughts, and react to challenges in ways that are not only familiar to you, but entirely foreseeable to anyone paying close enough attention. It's not merely that you have habits. It's that your habits have you. Your reactions to stress, for example, are not spontaneous acts of courage or failure. They are rehearsed responses shaped over years of repetition. When something goes wrong, you already know, if you're willing to admit it. Whether you will avoid it, confront it half-heartedly, or collapse under its weight. That pattern has played out before. Not once, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. And every time you repeat it, you carve that pathway deeper into your nervous system until eventually it becomes the default route through which all similar situations are processed. And that's where predictability takes root. Because if someone were to observe you long enough, they wouldn't need access to your thoughts to anticipate your behavior. Your patterns would betray you. They would see where you hesitate, where you rationalize, where you negotiate with yourself to avoid discomfort. They would recognize the exact moment you begin to justify inaction, dressing it up in language that sounds reasonable but is, in fact, a sophisticated form of self-deception. You might tell yourself that you're waiting for the right time, that you need more information, that the conditions aren't ideal. But beneath all of that is something far less flattering, a reluctance to step into the unknown, because the unknown demands something from you that your current self is not yet willing to give. and so you remain within the boundaries of what is familiar, repeating cycles that feel safe but ultimately constrain you. Now, here's the paradox. The very structure that makes you predictable is also what gives you the capacity to become unpredictable. Because those patterns, as rigid as they seem, are not immutable laws of nature. They are constructions, habits of perception and action that have been reinforced over time. And anything that has been constructed can, under the right conditions, be deconstructed. But that requires awareness, not the superficial kind where you casually acknowledge your flaws, but the kind that forces you to confront them in precise detail. It requires you to notice, in real time, when you are about to follow the same old script, to catch yourself at the exact moment where you would normally retreat, and to recognize that you are standing at a point of decision. And that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, because it strips away your excuses. It reveals that the line between who you are and who you could be is not drawn by fate or circumstance, but by the choices you repeatedly make when faced with discomfort. If, in that moment, you choose differently, even in a small way, you begin to disrupt the pattern. And when you do that consistently, something remarkable starts to happen. The predictability that once defined you begins to erode. Your behavior becomes less tied to your past and more aligned with a deliberate, conscious aim. And that is precisely where things become interesting, because a person who is no longer governed entirely by unconscious habit is not easily mapped, not easily anticipated, and not easily controlled. You might think of comfort as something you've earned, a reward for effort, a necessary refuge from the demands of the world. And to some degree, that's true. Human beings need stability. They need a certain level of predictability in order to function without descending into chaos. But there's a subtle and dangerous transformation that occurs when comfort stops being a temporary sanctuary and becomes a permanent dwelling place. Because the moment comfort becomes your default aim, rather than a byproduct of meaningful effort, it begins to reshape you in ways that are almost imperceptible at first. You start organizing your life not around what is necessary, or even what is meaningful, but around what is easy. Decisions are filtered through a simple, often unconscious question: does this reduce friction, or does it introduce it? And over time, you become extraordinarily skilled at minimizing that friction. You avoid difficult conversations. You postpone demanding goals. You retreat from challenges that require sustained attention and discipline. Not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm you immediately, but gradually, through a series of small concessions that accumulate. And that's precisely the problem. Because each time you choose the path of least resistance, you reinforce a version of yourself that is less capable than it could be. You weaken your tolerance for discomfort. You narrow the range of situations you can handle effectively. What once might have been a manageable challenge begins to feel overwhelming, not because the world has become more difficult, but because you have become less resilient. Now, the insidious aspect of this process is that it doesn't feel like deterioration. It feels like relief. It feels like you're taking care of yourself, like you're avoiding unnecessary stress. And in the short term, that interpretation is convincing. You experience less anxiety, less immediate pressure. But what you're actually doing is trading long-term capability for short-term ease. And that trade compounds over time. The routines you build around comfort become self-reinforcing systems. You wake up and follow familiar patterns that require minimal effort. You consume information that aligns with what you already believe, avoiding the cognitive strain of confronting ideas that might challenge you. You interact with people in ways that maintain harmony on the surface, even if it means suppressing truths that need to be spoken. And slowly, without any dramatic turning point, your world shrinks. Not physically necessarily, but psychologically. You become confined to a narrower band of experience, one where everything is manageable precisely because it is limited. And within that limitation, you might even convince yourself that you're functioning optimally. After all, you're not overwhelmed. You're not failing in any obvious way, but you're also not growing. And growth is not a comfortable process. It requires you to step outside the boundaries of what you currently know how to handle. It demands that you confront uncertainty, that you risk failure, that you tolerate the feeling of incompetence long enough to move beyond it. None of that aligns with a life organized around comfort. In fact, it stands in direct opposition to it. So you're faced with a fundamental tension. On one hand, there is the pull of ease, the desire to remain within the domain where you feel in control. On the other, there is the necessity of challenge, the call to expand that domain, even at the cost of temporary instability. And if you consistently choose comfort, you don't remain where you are. That's the illusion. You don't stay static. You regress because the world continues to move, continues to demand adaptation, continues to present complexities that cannot be navigated by a version of you that has been systematically softened by the avoidance of difficulty, which means that the very systems you build to protect yourself, to keep things predictable, manageable, and safe, become the structures that quietly limit what you are capable of becoming, shaping a life that is stable on the surface, but constrained at its core. You have likely been taught, in one form or another, to fear pressure, to interpret it as a signal that something is wrong, that you are being pushed beyond what is reasonable or sustainable. And so your instinct is to avoid it, to reduce it, to structure your life in such a way that you are rarely, if ever, forced into situations where the stakes feel high and the margin for error feels uncomfortably small. But that interpretation, while understandable, is incomplete, because pressure is not merely a force that acts upon you. It is also a force that reveals you. When circumstances become demanding, when time is limited, when expectations are high, when the outcome actually matters, you don't suddenly become someone new. You display with far greater clarity who you already are. The traits that remain hidden during periods of ease rise to the surface. Your discipline or lack of it, your capacity for focus, your tendency to take responsibility or to deflect it. All of it becomes visible, not just to others, but to you, in a way that is difficult to ignore. And that can be deeply unsettling, because it strips away the narratives you've constructed about yourself. It removes the comfortable distance between intention and action. You can no longer rely on what you say you would do in a hypothetical situation. You are confronted with what you actually do when the situation is real, immediate, and unavoidable. If you hesitate, that hesitation is real. If you panic, that panic is real. If you search for excuses instead of solutions, that tendency is not theoretical. It is operational. And yet, within that exposure lies something of immense value. Because once something is revealed, it can be addressed. What remains hidden cannot be corrected, but what is brought into the open can be examined, understood, and if necessary, transformed. Pressure, in that sense, functions as a kind of diagnostic tool. It identifies the gaps between who you are and who you could be, not in an abstract or philosophical way, but in the concrete details of your behavior. Now, the natural response to this kind of revelation is avoidance. If a situation exposes your weaknesses, the easiest solution is to avoid similar situations in the future, to retreat back into environments where those weaknesses are less likely to be triggered, where you can maintain a more favorable image of yourself without having to confront the underlying reality. But that strategy comes at a significant cost, because every time you avoid pressure, you also avoid the opportunity to develop the very capacities that pressure demands. You remain, in a sense, untested, and what is untested is unreliable, not because it is inherently flawed, but because its limitations are unknown, even to you. On the other hand, if you choose to engage with pressure voluntarily, something different begins to happen. You start to build familiarity with the conditions that once unsettled you. The initial shock diminishes. The chaos becomes more structured, more navigable. You learn, through repeated exposure, how to regulate your response, how to maintain focus, how to act effectively, even when the situation is far from ideal. And in doing so, you begin to close the gap. The version of you that is revealed under pressure starts to align more closely with the version of you that you aim to be. Not perfectly, not immediately, but progressively. Each encounter becomes an opportunity to refine your behavior, to correct errors, to strengthen what was previously insufficient. So pressure is not simply something that breaks you. It is something that clarifies you, that forces a confrontation between your current state and your potential, bringing into sharp focus the parts of yourself that you have neglected, ignored, or perhaps deliberately avoided acknowledging. There's a moment, quiet, often uncomfortable, where you realize that the circumstances of your life are not entirely imposed upon you. That despite all the complexity, all the external pressures, all the unpredictability of the world, there remains a domain that is undeniably yours. Your capacity to choose how you respond. And that realization is not liberating in the way people casually assume. It's heavy. Because the moment you recognize that you have a choice, you also recognize that you are, to a significant degree, accountable for the consequences of that choice. And most people resist that weight, not because they are incapable of carrying it, but because it demands something very specific, the abandonment of excuses that have, up until that point, served a protective function. It's much easier to attribute failure to external conditions, to luck, to other people, to timing, because doing so preserves your sense of innocence. You remain in your own narrative, someone who could have succeeded under different circumstances. But when you take responsibility, that narrative collapses. You are no longer insulated from the truth of your own inaction, your own hesitation, your own willingness to settle for less than what you are capable of achieving. And that's a difficult confrontation, because it forces you to see yourself not as a passive participant in your life, but as an active agent whose decisions have shaped the outcomes you now experience. Now, that might sound harsh, even unfair, because there are undoubtedly factors beyond your control. There are constraints, limitations, and unforeseen events that influence the trajectory of your life in ways you cannot fully predict or manage. But taking responsibility does not mean denying those realities. It means recognizing that, within those constraints, there is still a range of possible actions available to you, and that the choice among those actions matters. It matters more than you might be willing to admit. Because the moment you fully accept responsibility, something shifts in your orientation toward the world. You stop waiting. You stop looking outward for permission, for validation, for the perfect set of conditions that would justify taking action. Instead, you begin to ask a different question, given the situation as it is. What is the most effective thing I can do right now? And that question is powerful. It directs your attention away from what you cannot control and toward what you can influence. It compels you to engage with reality as it presents itself, rather than as you wish it would be. And in doing so, it transforms you from someone who is reactive to someone who is, at least in part, directive. Now, here's where things become interesting, Because a person who consistently takes responsibility begins to accumulate something that is not immediately visible, but is profoundly impactful. Competence. Not theoretical competence, not the kind that exists in plans or intentions, but practical competence built through repeated engagement with difficult problems. And as that competence grows, so does your capacity to handle increasingly complex situations. You become more capable of navigating uncertainty, more willing to confront challenges directly, less dependent on external guidance. And from the outside, this can appear almost unsettling, because you are no longer easily influenced by the same pressures that shape the behavior of others. You are not as susceptible to manipulation through fear or comfort, because your actions are guided by a principle that is internally anchored, and that makes you difficult to predict, difficult to control, and in a very real sense, difficult to limit within the boundaries that once defined you.